I'm Shakila, one of the MSN FNP students at Franklin University. I am going to talk about one of the very important diseases which is happening all around the world in this season called influenza. We'll talk about the details of influenza, like what is influenza, types of influenza viruses, the transmission process, complication of influenza, and the other details. So let's talk about the influenza. What is influenza? Influenza is a very contagious respiratory illness which usually occurs every year all around the world, leading to thousands of people's death. Additionally, severe outbreaks of pandemic influenza throughout the history have caused the deaths of millions. Influenza or flu is a contagious respiratory illness that caused by influenza viruses that infect the nose, throat, and lungs. There are several types of influenza viruses like A, B, C, or D, but the most common human type of influenza viruses are type A and type B. Unfortunately, about 8% of the US population gets sick from flu in each season. Most experts believe that the flu viruses are spreading throughout the droplet transmission. The influenza viruses found mostly from the migratory birds, which are affecting the domestic poultry. It can be transmitted from birds to mammals and in some limited circumstances to human. The influenza viruses are spreading through the large particle respiratory droplet transmission. In other words, when an infected person coughs or sneezes near a susceptible person, virus can exit the infected person and enter into the new host. Transmission generally requires the close contact between the source and the infected person because the droplet cannot remain suspended in the air and generally travel only a short distance. Contact with contaminated surfaces is another possible source of transmission, as the virus can live on the inanimate surface for up to 48 hours and go on clothing for up to 12 hours. This graphic will show the different location of the influenza virus attack, causing different types of respiratory infections. Influenza infection is largely limited to respiratory tract and can produce myriad of symptoms, including rhinitis, pharyngitis, bronchitis, and pneumonia. Although viremia, which is the detectable virus level in the blood, rarely occurs by influenza, the bodily pain associated with influenza infection are what sets it apart from the other respiratory illnesses caused by the virus. Let's talk about some influenza symptoms. The typical incubation period for influenza virus after the exposure to a person is 1 to 4 days, on average about 2 days. The onset of influenza is typically sudden and abrupt. The patient cannot often remember the exact time at which they began to feel sick. Symptoms typically include fever, muscle pain, the other name is myalgia, headache, sore throat, stuffy nose, also rhinorrhea like runny nose, and cough. Patients may also feel very tired or fatigued. The acute illness typically lasts between 5 to 7 days, at which point the patient typically starts to improve, although fatigue and cough may last for several weeks afterwards. Most of the adult people can be infectious for about 3 to 5 days after the symptom onset, whereas the children may be infectious for 10 or more days, and the immunosuppressed patients can be susceptible to spread the infection for several weeks. Let's talk about some complications of influenza. Most people who get flu typically suffer for 3 to 7 days with those myalgia like body pain or cough, which may last for even up to 2 weeks. Some people will develop complications such as pneumonia as a result of flu, some of which can be very life-threatening and may result in death. Sinus and ear infections are some of the examples of moderate complications from flu, while pneumonia is a serious flu complication that can result from either flu virus infection alone or from other co-infection of flu virus and bacteria. Other possible serious complications triggered by flu can include inflammation of the heart, or other name is myocarditis, brain or encephalitis, muscle tissue infection or myositis, and rhabdomyolysis. And one of the most severe complications could be multi-organ failure, like respiratory and kidney failure. Usually the high-risk group of people for these complications are obviously children or elderly people, pregnant women, or the immunocompromised individuals. Let's talk about pneumonia, which is one of the most common complications of influenza. As we mentioned previously, pneumonia caused in the population who has all those status like immunosuppression or other comorbidities, particularly related to severe respiratory complications such as pneumonia. The primary influenza, which means the direct infection of the lung covering by the influenza virus, can produce pneumonia, which has a mortality rate between 10 to 20%. Onset is often abrupt and very dramatic, often progressing within 24 hours to severe disease with respiratory failure by producing shock and ultimately death. Most of the times when flu happens, people get the secondary bacterial infection in the lungs, causing pneumonia and make people more sick. The most common bacteria which can cause this secondary infection are Streptococcus pneumoniae, Streptococcus aureus, Haemophilus influenza virus, or some nosocomial gram-negative bacteria. Another type of complication from post-flu is Ray's syndrome, which is very rare but life-threatening syndrome that is almost exclusively seen in children and teenagers in association with a viral illness, most often influenza or varicella. The illness is characterized by fever and rash in the early stage of the disease, followed by swelling of the liver and brain that leads to encephalopathy or abnormal functioning of the brain, liver failure, and often death. Supportive care is the only treatment. The exact cause of this deadly syndrome is still unknown, but there is a thought to be an association with the use of aspirin. This has led the FDA to require warning labels on the aspirin products in US, instructing avoidance